Paddington 2, Chapter 14. Marmalade is served. Back in the prison, Paddington and Knuckles were getting ready to serve breakfast to a canteen full of hungry men. "Good morning, gentlemen," said Paddington, addressing the room. "Chef McGinty would like to propose for your delight an orange marmalade served on warm, crustless slices of bread, topped with another slice of crustless bread. Bon appetit!" The prisoners did not move. They sat in silence, staring at their plates. Knuckles stuck his head through the hatch and yelled, "Take it or leave it," before disappearing from view and slamming the hatch shut behind him. Paddington stared after the chef as the men began muttering to each other. "Please excuse me," Paddington said to the prisoners. He went into the kitchen and found Knuckles sulking. "Why don't you come and join the others?" he said to him. "I don't want to," Knuckles mumbled. "Why not? Are you scared of what they might think?" Paddington asked. "No!" Knuckles shouted. His expression was immediately crumpled, and he asked, "What do they think? Do they like it? What did they say?" "Well," Paddington began. Knuckles didn't give him a chance to finish. He flew into a tantrum, kicked over the pans and knocked over the tins and the packets. "I knew it! They hate it, don't they? My father always said I would amount to nothing, and he was right." Paddington peeped over the hatch and put a paw out to calm the chef down. "Knuckles! Knuckles!" "What?" "Come and look," said Paddington, gesturing through the hatch to what was going on in the canteen. Knuckles came over to join Paddington. He looked out to see every single one of the prisoners was devouring their sandwiches. They were making ecstatic noises, smacking and licking their lips and groaning with delight. The marmalade sandwiches were clearly the most delicious food the men had tasted in years. "Come on," said Paddington. He held out his paw. "You need to let them thank you." Paddington led a reluctant Knuckles into the room. The prisoners immediately leapt to their feet and gave the chef a standing ovation, cheering and clapping and stamping. "3 cheers for Knuckles," one of them cried. "Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray!" Everyone joined in. Knuckles glowed with pride and happiness. Phibbs, the Australian, called out, "Great tucker, mate. You got anything else for pudding?" Knuckles' face began to rearrange itself into its usual expression of anger. Paddington saw it, and thinking on his paws, he stepped in quickly to prevent another explosion. "We only know how to make marmalade, I'm afraid, unless you know any recipes." "This lot doesn't know their paprika from their pectin," Paddington Knuckles said. Spoon piped up, "My great-grandmother used to make a lovely chocolate roulade. I think I can remember the recipe." "Charlie Rumble makes a mean apple crumble," said another prisoner. "I can do strawberry panna cotta with pomegranate glaze," offered T-Bone. Paddington beamed. "That sounds wonderful, doesn't it, Knuckles?" Knuckles was beaming too. "Yeah," he said, "let's get cooking." Over the next month, Paddington got to work on the prison menu. Afternoon tea quickly became an institution. Every day at 4 o'clock, Paddington would walk the length of the canteen with a dessert trolley. It was groaning with piles of delicious cakes. The canteen itself was transformed into a delightful tea room with gingham tablecloths. "This is the life," said T-Bone one afternoon. He was tucking into a giant slice of Victoria sponge filled to bursting with raspberry jam and whipped cream. "Why didn't we think of this before?" said Spoon. He licked his lips and took a bite of the gooey bakewell tart. "It's the perfect way to spend the afternoon," said another prisoner, called the Professor, as he picked up a piece of cake. "Hum," said Paddington, passing by with the trolley. "Excuse me, Professor, but what would Aunt Lucy say?" he asked, eyeing the Professor's fingers. The Professor looked sheepishly. "Always use a cake fork," he said. "Well then," said Paddington. The Professor put the cake down, and using the fork he shoved the whole slice into his mouth in one go. Paddington tutted. "This is going to take a while for you to learn your manners," he said. But learn they did. Over time, the prisoners became very skillful at using cake forks, tucking napkins into the front of their uniforms and remembering to say please and thank you. The warden was so delighted with the prisoners' behaviour and so full of cake himself that even he slowly became more relaxed. In fact, it was not long before he was reading stories at bedtime through the loudspeakers. Everyone was happy, except Paddington. The night before visiting day, he sat in his cell and looked at the photo he had of himself with the Browns and Mrs. Bird. "I can't wait to see you all," he said, and stared longingly at the picture of the family he missed so much. "It's all very well having new friends and lots of delicious food, but this place isn't a home. I only hope you will be bringing me good news." The Browns did bring good news, but it was not good news. They showed Paddington a newspaper with pictures of a nun, a beefeater, and a king. These pictures were accompanied by the words, "3 shadowy figures spotted snooping around London landmarks this week." There was also another image of Paddington with a story underneath that told how he had broken into Mr. Gruber's and was now getting his just desserts. "Well, the last part is true," said Paddington. He wiped the remnants of cream from his whiskers. "At least the food is good in here now." "Don't worry, Paddington," said Judy. She spoke through a microphone on the other side of the glass. "We'll get you out of here. We think we've made a breakthrough, and it looks like there's a thief that you saw is part of a criminal gang. And they're using the pop-up book as a treasure map," Jonathan added. Mr. Brown was the only member of the family who seemed unconvinced. "Well, it's a theory," he said. "Do you know who they are?" Paddington said, looking through the glass at the pictures. "Not yet, dearie," said Mrs. Bird. Knuckles appeared suddenly behind Paddington. "Maybe I should take a look," he said, leaning over the bear's shoulder. Mr. Brown bristled. "Excuse me," he said. "This is a private conversation." "It's all right, Mr. Brown," said Paddington. He turned and smiled at the chef. "This is my friend, Knuckles." Knuckles grinned. "How do you do?" he said to the Browns. Immediately, a host of other faces appeared with Knuckles. Paddington began a long introduction. "This is Fibs, this is Spoon." He pointed to each prisoner in turn. "Jimmy the Snitch, T-Bone, the Professor, Squeaky, Pete." "Hello," said Squeaky Pete in a high-pitched voice. "Double Bass Bob." "Hello," said Double Bass Bob in a very deep voice. "This is Farmer Jack," Paddington went on. "Old Timer, Mad Dog, Sir Geoffrey, Wilcott." "I hope I can rely on your vote," said Sir Geoffrey. "Johnny Cashpoint," said Paddington. "Kirchin," said Johnny. "And Charlie Rumble." Charlie growled. Mr. Brown jumped in alarm. Mrs. Brown was charmed. "Oh, it's so lovely to meet you all," she said with a warm smile. "I must say it's such a relief to know that Paddington has already made such sweet friends." "Would you excuse me for a moment?" Mr. Brown said to Paddington. He leaned over and flicked a switch on the countertop. The lights went out on the brown side of the glass. "What are you doing, Mary?" he said. "I'm talking to the nice men," his wife replied. Mrs. Bird smirked. "Nice men?" Mr. Brown exclaimed. "We can't trust this lot. I mean, look at them. Talk about a rogues gallery. Hideous. And as for that bearded baboon in the middle, he hasn't got two brain cells to rub together." "We can still hear you, Mr. Brown," said Knuckles through the microphone. Mr. Brown froze. "That was the light you turned off, Mr. Brown," Knuckles went on. "The microphone switch is the one that says microphone on it." Judy rolled her eyes and flicked the light back on. Mr. Brown swallowed nervously. "Gentlemen, if I've offended you in any way," he began. Knuckles grinned. "Don't worry about it," he said. "We're fond of the little fellow." He ruffled Paddington's fur. "About the pictures in that paper, though," he said, pointing to the photos. "You should realise that if anyone can recognise a criminal gang, it's us lot." Judy sat up and said eagerly, "Really? That's amazing. We would be so grateful for your help." She held the paper to the glass again. "Recognise any of them?" Knuckles took a look, then shaking his head said, "Afraid not, lads." All the prisoners shook their heads. Sir Geoffrey said primly, "I'm afraid I couldn't possibly comment." "I'm sorry to say it," Knuckles said to Paddington, "but I think your family are barking up the wrong tree. A nun, a beefeater, and a king? Looks more like a fancy dress party than a criminal gang to me." Poor Paddington was completely crestfallen. "What are we going to do now?" he asked. The Browns looked at one another sadly. Mrs. Bird leaned forward and looked Paddington in the eye. "Don't despair, dearie," she said. "We'll have you out of here soon. You just sit tight for now." "It doesn't look like I have much choice," thought Paddington.